Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by Omen's new wireless range of mice, keyboards, and headsets.
Decades after the release of Super Mario All-Stars on the Super NES, Nintendo is revisiting this concept with Super Mario 3D All-Stars, a compilation featuring Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy. Each of the three games has received several enhancements in their Switch debut, but is it enough? Today, I want to check out each of the new versions included in this collection to better understand how they stack up. We'll take a look at the games running on original hardware and compare them against this new version. Is the collection worthy of the All-Stars name? Let's find out. When Nintendo released Super Mario All-Stars for Super NES back in the early 90s, it's fair to say that it left a huge impact. The development team completely reworked the 8-bit Mario games with entirely new artwork, sound, and features. It was an ambitious but amazing project. It wasn't the first to attempt this, but it was a shining example of what a remake could bring to the table. Super Mario 3D All-Stars, however, is a little different. Rather than remaking these games from scratch, Nintendo has instead opted to update them in a more subtle fashion to better mesh with modern displays. These are effectively equivalent to the modern-day remaster, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. While each game has its fair share of quirks, enough changes have been made to smooth over the experience while preserving the original games. Before we jump into each individual game though, you may be wondering just how these were brought over to Nintendo Switch. Emulation? Native port? Well, it wasn't long before the community figured out how it works. Basically, all three games rely on emulation. This means that any enhanced assets we might discuss, such as higher resolution textures or improved video playback, are essentially injected into each game. The emulation was apparently developed by Nintendo's European Research and Development Group, which was responsible for the Super NES and NES mini consoles. Curiously, this collection also relies on the Vulkan API, as opposed to Nvidia and Nintendo's more common proprietary API. Even more unexpected, according to Oatmeal Dome on Twitter, Super Mario Galaxy was recompiled to run natively on the Switch's ARM processor, but most other tasks, such as graphics rendering, are handled via emulation. So we're basically looking at a solution here that could be applied to future Nintendo GameCube and Wii titles, not to mention N64 of course, which is pretty cool. With that in mind, let's jump into the details. And we're kicking off with Super Mario 64. This seminal launch title for Nintendo 64 defined what a 3D game could be when it arrived back in 1996. It was a stunning example of what the N64 and 3D gameplay could deliver, and it forever changed the industry. For such an early example of a 3D platformer, it's really remarkable just how well it holds up today. Nintendo really nailed it. So how does it compare on Switch? Well, for starters, Nintendo has bumped the resolution up from 320 by 240 on N64 to 1280 by 720 on Switch. This goes for both handheld and docked mode. It's a sizable leap, no doubt, but it's disappointing that the game retains the original 4:3 aspect ratio, and it's something that could have been corrected. Other iterations, shall we say, have demonstrated this in action, but this is what we're stuck with in the official collection. Despite this, it still looks surprisingly nice on its own. I would have enjoyed proper 1080p support rather than 720p across both modes, of course, but the game still appears very sharp and clean. Now, part of this is due to the enhancements made to the game's UI. All fonts and HUD artwork have been redrawn at a higher resolution, while aiming to mimic the look of the original game, and it definitely elevates the presentation on a modern screen. More importantly, input latency is kept to a minimum. The game feels suitably responsive and quick, as it should. The Virtual Console release back on Wii U was known for its atrocious input latency, which effectively ruined the game, but here it plays great. It's also worth noting that Wii U Virtual Console version is just the original game with poorly scaled HUD elements, a lower resolution, and of course it appears rather dim like many other Virtual Console releases during this era of Nintendo. So yeah, that version wasn't great. Another cool detail, textures such as the paintings, various flags, some enemy faces, and more actually receive updated textures. It appears that they may have used some sort of AI upscaling or other technique to improve the quality of the textures themselves. What's interesting about this is that they're basically injecting these new textures in real time as you play using Lua scripts. When the game calls for a certain texture, for instance, and there is a replacement texture available, this new version intercepts that call and replaces it with a new texture. Nintendo did not, however, go the extra mile when it comes to rendering accuracy. You see, the Switch port uses 4-point texture filtering rather than the 3-point method used on N64 hardware. This has an impact on the filter pattern visible across textures. I discussed this topic in the Doom 64 video, where Night Dive took the time to simulate this technique in their conversion. Notice the elongated hexagonal pattern? That's what's missing in the Switch version of Mario 64. I know, it's subtle, but it's something I would have liked. This version also lacks any sort of anti-aliasing, which again is something the N64 hardware offers natively. It was the first console to do this. Another enjoyable little detail ties into the LOD system. In the original, the game would swap in a lower detail Mario model at a certain distance from the camera, but only when moving. If you stand still, it's the full detail model. The low resolution output of N64 somewhat masks this, but when you play it at a high resolution, such as in this collection, this becomes extremely visible, allowing you to more clearly see the rather hilarious looking low detail Mario model. Now, on top of all this, the frame rate is still just capped at 30 frames per second. This is perhaps the most disappointing aspect for sure, as I feel increasing the frame rate to 60 frames per second would have definitely improved the experience, something the community has achieved elsewhere in fact. Of course, in this case, that would have required manipulating the original codebase, I believe. The emulated nature of this collection means that this was likely off the table. Unfortunately, it also exhibits mild frame pacing issues, as you can see here on the frame time graph. It's still a lot smoother than the N64 original, of course, but it's not quite where I would expect. Which is an interesting point really, as that actually made lining up shots rather difficult. Unlike many games today, Mario 64 doesn't drop frames when it misses its frame rate target. Instead, it simply continues to draw every frame but runs slow. This causes it to go out of sync when comparing with the Switch version, which does not drop frames. Another curious thing though is the audio latency. There's a very slight delay between when a sound effect should be triggered and when it's actually played. On original hardware, it's like this. But on Switch, it's more like this. Now, if you can't hear the difference between that, you're in luck. You won't be bothered by this at all, but for those that can, you may notice this as you play. I didn't find it too distracting myself, but it is there. You may have also noticed that the sound seems slightly muffled on Switch compared to the N64 original. So yeah, this is an interesting one. Technically speaking, this is the best emulated version Nintendo has ever released. But at the same time, it's difficult not to feel slightly disappointed. We know the Switch can deliver a full 1080p 60 frames per second version of Mario 64. Even still, what is here is plenty solid. It's still Mario 64 after all. Now, Super Mario Sunshine is perhaps more interesting. Unlike Mario 64, Sunshine never received an official re-release, so it's fascinating to see how it translates over to the Switch. Super Mario Sunshine itself is somewhat of a divisive game that attempts something rather different from the traditional Mario games by focusing on FLUDD, the talking, water-spraying wonder backpack Mario wears throughout most of the adventure. More so than Mario 64, Sunshine really benefits from the jump to the Switch. You see, the stages in this game are all rather busy with a lot of objects and interactive surfaces to play in and around. But at 480p, this results in a somewhat noisy image, making it difficult to see distant objects clearly. On Switch, the resolution is bumped to a full 1080p, and the aspect ratio is increased to 16:9. The combination of these elements really opens the game up in a big way. It's now easier to visually parse each stage from a distance, improving the overall feeling of navigation and exploration. Furthermore, in the original, the HUD is simply too large, occupying a significant portion of screen real estate at any point. With the HD version, however, HUD elements appear slightly smaller and are pushed out to the edges of the screen, making it easier to see everything in front of you. It's a nice change. Like 64, numerous other elements have been updated for modern displays. The entire UI has been recreated in a higher resolution with sharp, clean fonts and art direction. Furthermore, textures actually appear sharper than in the original as well. In some cases, it almost appears as if they've used some sort of upscaling technique to enhance the original artwork. It's not a game changer, but it does improve image quality slightly. Sunshine is also the first Nintendo-developed Mario game to feature full-motion video sequences. Many of the story beats are told through these cinematics, and on GameCube, the quality is rather abysmal. Thankfully on Switch, it appears as if Nintendo has used some sort of AI upscaling technique to improve the quality of the renders. They're not perfect, but it's a massive improvement over the original release. In addition, all the visual effects are intact, though rendering at a higher resolution does change the perception somewhat. The heat haze, for instance, looks rather different when displayed at a high resolution. This can have nice benefits though. The render to texture feature used to create reflections updates at a higher resolution, so reflections do appear sharper. The water is of course fully intact and accurate. And everything else disappears cleaner yet still suitably Mario Sunshine. Even the controls work well. The original uses the GameCube's multi-function triggers in conjunction with the water pack to determine whether you plant your feet when spraying or move freely. On Switch, this isn't possible, so they simply map these two functions to the right two shoulder buttons. It's effective, but it's a shame that there is no support for the GameCube controller a la Smash. So yeah, visually, the increased resolution, improved user interface, and wider field of view all make for a better experience all around, but there is one significant disappointment here, and that's the frame rate. Once again, Nintendo has opted to stick to its guns and run the game at 30 frames per second, much like the original. However, it's more disappointing in this case, as early prototypes of Sunshine, first shown off at Space World, were running at a full 60 frames per second. The final game was a step down in that sense. Furthermore, when using a Wii console, the homebrew community even managed to uncap the frame rate, allowing Sunshine to run at 60 frames per second. So in that sense, I feel that this is something that the team absolutely could have implemented in time for release. Although who knows, maybe a bug or two crops up later in the game when running at a higher frame rate, but still, it's disappointing. Worse still, there are now minor frame pacing issues that pop up during gameplay. It's not even as fluid as the GameCube release, which makes this version of Sunshine somewhat of a mixed bag. The improvements overall are fantastic, but the frame rate is difficult to ignore. Still, I think this is a net win overall, and it does look nice, especially running on the Switch in portable mode. So at this point, the first two games are reasonable but conservative in terms of what is on offer. But what about Mario Galaxy? Targeting the more powerful Nintendo Wii, Super Mario Galaxy really demonstrates Nintendo's ability to push limited hardware to its limits. Galaxy combines flawlessly executed art direction with the fluidity of 60 frames per second. It's one of the very best looking games on Wii, and I would argue it's held up better visually than many other 2007, 2008 PS3 and Xbox 360 games. That said, it was difficult to fully appreciate this at the time, as the Wii, I feel, is a system that was designed very much around CRTs, not flat panels. It looks stunning on a nice CRT, but blow it up to a late 2000s LCD panel, or even a plasma in some cases, and the visuals are just blurry and pixelated. Which is why I was eager to check this out on the Switch. Like Sunshine, Galaxy aims for a full 1080p output, but this time around, it does seem to use some sort of resolution scaling based on what's happening on screen, so image quality isn't perfect. But how does it stack up against the original game? Well, once again, things like menus and HUD elements have all received a fresh coat of paint with higher resolution assets galore. They look excellent. Furthermore, the video sequences used at certain points, which were encoded at 60 frames per second, have been re-rendered at a higher resolution. Though curiously, it seems like the RGB range is different, leading to a slightly washed out image, though perhaps it is an improvement. That's kind of up to you to decide. Unfortunately, not everything is quite perfect, Super Mario Galaxy relies a lot on these wide open scenes with dramatic color gradients and transparency effects to create the illusion of space and atmosphere. On Switch, these effects are reproduced, but with significant color banding. Look at the glow around the Luma here. It's a smooth gradient on the Wii, but there's visible banding on Switch, and that's also the case in the background. Now, this isn't visible in all scenes, of course, so it doesn't really spoil the visuals, but when you do spot it, it can be distracting. It's also interesting how the controls have been implemented. The pointer is still very much a requirement here. After all, the game was designed around this, but it feels a little strange when using something like the Pro controller, as you're not really pointing at the screen as you would with a Wii remote. At least motion controls have been mapped to a button, so rather than shaking your controller to perform an action, which is still an option by the way, you can just press Y. Still, this is the same great game as the original Wii release, and aside from the color banding, it really does look better overall. Most importantly though, it runs at a full 60 frames per second, just like the original version. The frame rate is mostly locked too, so it feels really great and responsive to play. It's actually difficult to go from say Sunshine or 64 over to Galaxy and then back as a result. Now you'll notice I said mostly locked, and that's because there is actually some slowdown in the game. It's usually relatively minor like this, but you will notice it from time to time. Because this game uses a dynamic resolution system, it's entirely possible that it's just scraping the threshold of dropping the resolution, and instead you get dropped frames rather than the lower pixel count. Thankfully, these instances are relatively uncommon, so it's not a big deal, but they are there. The fact that the frame rate is a match for the refresh rate of 60 Hz also ensures that frame pacing is not an issue. This is only a problem when dealing with frame rates lower than the refresh rate. Here, everything looks perfect. So yeah, that's 3 games in a nutshell. But what about the package as a whole? So my thoughts on this are that Nintendo has done a reasonable job overall, but they haven't gone the extra mile as I might have hoped. Each game represented in this collection received numerous enhancements, especially in relation to textures and UI elements, and it's clear that they put time into ensuring that certain elements were just right. The fact that they even went so far as to carefully improve the full motion videos suggests that they did care. It's just that things like bad frame pacing in Mario 64 and Sunshine, the 4:3 aspect ratio in 64, and the lack of performance enhancements are somewhat disappointing. If I had to rank each experience though, I would say that Super Mario Sunshine benefits the most from this remaster. The wider aspect ratio and sharper distant detail makes it easier to parse its large levels. It works really well, plus the new art is always appreciated. To me, it feels like this game received the most effort, even if the frame rate isn't quite what I'd like to see. Mario Galaxy then is perhaps second place, as it replicates the experience complete with a high frame rate at a much higher resolution, solving the poor output issues of the original Wii. It's just a shame about the color banding, which does detract slightly from the presentation at points. Lastly, there's Super Mario 64. While the art enhancements are certainly welcome, the lack of a 60 frames per second mode combined with the original 4:3 aspect ratio and inaccurate texture filtering makes it difficult for me to play this over the original version. Of course, it's better than the previous Virtual Console releases, so that's something. So in that sense, it's a reasonable remaster, but not an exceptional one. Whether the drawbacks are a deal breaker though is something each person is going to have to weigh for themselves. You know the options available, it's up to you to decide. Still, even with the flaws, we are talking about some classic 3D Mario action here, and it is a joy to have these games available on a portable system like Switch. These are still remarkable games, and they are worth experiencing today. But that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff, and come find us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
Featuring its new Warp wireless technology, Omen's PC peripherals allow for lag-free gaming. From the 360-degree audio of its Omen frequency headphones, the 180-hour battery life of the Vector mouse, and the 2.4 GHz connection of its Spacer keyboard, Omen has you covered for the ultimate wireless experience.